This podcast was recorded on the ancestral lands on Treaty 1 territory, the traditional territory of the Anishinaabe, Cree, Oji-Cree, Dakota, and the Dene peoples, and on the homeland of the Métis Nation.
This is Humans on Rights, a podcast advocating for the education of human rights. Here's your host, Stuart Murray.
My guest today is the Executive Director of Sunshine House, Levi Foy. We're going to learn a lot about Sunshine House, the great work that they do in the community, and we're going to try and spend a bit of time understanding the importance of a major program that Sunshine House has amongst many. But one of the major programs they have is a program called MOPS, MOPS, which is short for Mobile Overdose Prevention Site. So on that note, Levi Foy, welcome to Humans on Rights.
Hi, thanks for having me.
So Levi, you're obviously very engaged in a very important initiative in the community, but how did you find yourself involved in this? Did you go to school in Winnipeg, and are you a Manitoban?
My father's family is originally from Couchiching First Nation, which is on the border of Ontario and Minnesota. And my mom's family is from Saskatchewan, and then they converged in southwestern Manitoba and met. And I was raised in various communities in southwestern Manitoba. And then I went to school at the University of Winnipeg in the early 2000s. And when I was done there, I left for about 7 years, and I came back to Winnipeg in 2014, and I started working at Sunshine House.
So the 7 years you went, is there something you were doing that, got you engaged, that when you saw the opportunity at Sunshine House, it just made sense? Were you doing stuff that was involved in helping others during that 7-year time frame when you were away from Winnipeg?
I left and I went to work in Mexico for 2 years. And then I moved to Guelph, and I was there for about a year to do my master's, about 14 months. And I returned back to Mexico for another 6 months. And then when I returned and I was completed all my studies, I moved back home to my community to help care for my aging grandfather, who at the time we were told he had about 6 months to live, but he ended up sticking around for 2 years. So I spent 2 years working back in my home community in child and family services in a variety of roles. And one of the roles was to work on systems communication and to understand some of the challenges that families were having in reunification plans, because it was a First Nations child and family service agency. So a lot of the times family members faced barriers with if they would be completing some of the requirements for family reunification, but then those systems weren't allowed to talk to each other because of personal health information protections and all of those things that we put in place that are good in general, but sometimes we require systems to talk to one another in order for the safety and health of everybody. I did that for a couple of years, and then lived as a two-spirit queer person. Living in rural Ontario wasn't necessarily the best place for me, not in terms of I had tons of family support and my community was always very supportive of me. It was just I required some additional social kind of benefits. There's not a lot of options there for like nightlife and other queer communities. So when I was presented with the opportunity to work at Sunshine House, I jumped on it, and because it was something I wasn't super familiar with, got involved in a side project that was mapping areas in Winnipeg where people were buying and selling sex in public spaces, where people were buying and selling drugs, and then where men were having sex with men in public spaces. And so through that experience and that little project, we interacted and engaged with a lot of queer people who were substance users and who were racial and who were Indigenous or racialized, and who didn't really have places to go that weren't bars or weren't healthcare clinics. So we decided to start operating a small drop-in program that ended up running twice a week and continues to run twice a week, specifically to us LGBTQIA plus people in Winnipeg who really don't have a lot of places where they can build community and don't necessarily feel engaged at mainstream services like Rainbow Resource Center or whatever. We do have a really positive relationship with Rainbow Resource Center, but we also understand that we work with kind of oftentimes very different groups. But we have lots of folks who will use both Sunshine House and Rainbow That was a part-time job. So then I had to work elsewhere. So I spent some time at Main Street Project and I worked in the shelter there. I also spent some time working at the University of Winnipeg. I helped with the at-home chez soi study. So that was the Housing First national study, and doing participant interviews with people who were engaged in that project for the follow-up study. I worked at Aboriginal Health and Wellness, and then I returned back to the University of Winnipeg and worked in the Indigenous Affairs Department for a couple of years. And so that's kind of my role. And then I came on here at Sunshine House and became the executive director on April 1st, 2019.
Wow. Thank you for sharing. There's a lot. You've seen a lot. You've traveled a lot. You've experienced a lot. When you just talked about your master's that you what did you do your master's in, if you don't mind me asking?
Latin American and Caribbean Studies, with history as the kind of the department that I worked closely with. History and art history. So when I was living in Mexico, I developed relationships with a lot of mushes. So that would be very similar to Two-Spirit, in Canadian context. So folks who identify particularly on the gender diverse side of the spectrum. So and mushes in this particular region in Oaxaca possessed a really unique place. And so one of my dear friends, I told her that I was planning on going back to school, and she gave me this really great topic. She's like, people always come down and they write stories about us, but they never ever come back and they share our stories. So can you find those stories and bring them back to us? And so then that was really my project. So I really wanted to bring those stories back, but contextualize it in kind of a larger narrative of the way that English media in particular has always represented Mexican Indigenous femininity as being this wholly different, kind of weird other, queer other. And so that was my research project. It exists, it's out there, but the thing I learned the most about it was just developing really strong connections with Indigenous trans folks who really have done a lot of work in community building, particularly around helping their smaller communities navigate HIV, navigate things like human trafficking, and navigating constant influx of queer refugees who might be passing through their territories, and how learning how folks are supporting one another in areas where there's not a lot of resources for these types of things.
And so, Levi, when you find yourself working or getting involved with Sunshine House, and now as you are as the executive director, I like you, and I'm kind of embarrassed to say, but I didn't know a lot about Sunshine House, and I went on your website, and the amount of work you do in the community is unbelievable, and it's really quite important and very impressive. We want to talk about that. But what was your introduction to Sunshine House? Was it through the projects that you just mentioned, talking about pilot projects where you're looking where men are having sex in the city in different locations or selling drugs? Was that sort of your introduction, or how did you find out about the good work that people are doing at Sunshine House?
That was it. That's how I had a friend named Lucas, and they called me one day and they said, "Hey, there's this little weird woman who I think will like you, and she runs this organization called Sunshine House, and we've been working with them on the solvent user project, and so I think you and her would have a really good fit." And so I met her. Her name was Margaret Ormond, and so she had been doing this type of work for pretty much her whole life. She had a background as a nurse, and did a lot of research, and facilitated really interesting research projects between the University of Manitoba and other institutions, particularly with folks who I guess you would call marginalized or systems entrenched people. And so so that was my first introduction. She was like, "I think you would be a good fit for this type of project, given kind of your knowledge and firsthand experience." And so there was a team of 8 of us who would walk around, who went around to various parts of the city, talking to neighbors, talking to community members where they might have seen these types of activities happening, and then working and then kind of verifying that these activities were happening by talking to folks who may or may not have been engaged in these activities. That's how we did it. Sunshine House has always been at that point in time, between 2007 and 2020, really, at the onset of the COVID-19 pandemic. Sunshine House was this organization that kind of worked to identify gaps within systems and to facilitate good relations between academic institutions or research institutions and community members who these institutions sometimes have not so great relationships with, but are interested in having them participate in types of studies. And so Margaret did a lot of that type of facilitation through various projects like the Solvent User Recreation Project, as well as this mapping project. So Sunshine House maintained kind of three programs, or one drop-in program and a Sunday brunch program. Those were always the pillar, and they continue to be some of the pillars of what we go forward with today, even in spite of all these massive changes that's happened since COVID. So everything is centered, all of our relationship building is centered around relationships that we form out of our drop-in spaces, and then supporting people in whatever their journey might look like going forward. And so that's how we identify what we need to be doing is through what community tells us to do. We formalized some of these processes through the establishment of community advisory circles, which are made up entirely of people who are using our programs, and then they can kind of inform us directly like what kinds of work we need to do. And that's how we were able to form the Mobile Overdose Prevention Site. It was not something that we just dreamed up one day. This was iterated to us through community, particularly as we saw a lot of fluctuation in the supply that was coming into Manitoba that was disrupted during the COVID pandemic because borders were closed. There was not a lot of movement of people, and there was not a lot of movement of goods. And so with all of those restrictions, there was lots of different unforeseen impacts that I don't think people really took into consideration when we were doing what was necessary at that time to kind of keep the overall public health system functioning in ways that it could at that crucial time.
The amount of stuff that you're involved in your background is amazingly impressive. And I'm trying to sort of take notes as we go here so that I can come back and sort of try to get some clarification on some issues. Tell me just quickly, who started Sunshine House from your perspective? Are you aware of how the origin of Sunshine House came about?
Yeah, so Sunshine House was formed in the late 80s, early 90s as a response to the lack of support that was being provided to folks during the HIV epidemic at the time. And Sunshine House was a coalition of folks who were looking at providing some sorts of services and supports to those people who might be at higher risk, particularly at that time, gay men who might be at higher risk of contracting HIV. And so providing them with safer sex supplies, education, information. And so it started in 1991 kind of as a Kali Shiva AIDS Society. And then from there, it was part of the large coalition of community organizations, or the growing coalition of community organizations in the early 90s supporting people with who were living with HIV and AIDS. In 1999, we started the drop-in programs under the name Sunshine House, or just under drop-in programs. And then in 2001, it became formalized as Sunshine House. And in 2007, Kali Shiva and those services stopped and switched primarily under the umbrella of Sunshine House to focus on drop-in programming as opposed to doing AIDS or HIV/AIDS service delivery, knowing full well that we still retained many of those contacts, but we just didn't have the capacity to provide the same types of supports, and other organizations were also providing those supports at that time.
Forgive me for asking, but clarification, please. Levi, am I going to say it right? Kali Shiva program?
Kali Shiva, yeah.
Yeah, Kali Shiva. I'm sorry. Can you just give us a quick explanation of what is Kali Shiva and what does that program all about?
I don't actually know where the name came from because it existed before I did. It preceded me by some time, but it was primarily to provide services for folks who were living with HIV and AIDS, and then also to provide some support for those people. Particularly, there was a lot of program and support for people who were using substances, who were at higher risk, particularly injection drug users, as well as supports for women, because once we dealt with the realities that HIV impacted all communities in various different ways, then there was some resources and support for women who would be at higher risk, as well as we knew full well that people who use drugs were at greater risk of contracting because of the lack of services available and the lack of clean supplies that people needed, safer sex supplies, safer injection supplies, that kind of stuff. So harm reduction, the model of harm reduction that we used was really born out of that Kali Shiva time and the experiences that we learned through supporting people navigating that very unique time in the history of Winnipeg.
So one of the questions always that comes up with, issues around safe injection sites, different, elements that are involved with any drug, any toxicity issue at all is around the issue around the term harm reduction. And for many, I think it's misunderstood exactly what it is. So I'd love from your perspective as the executive director of Sunshine House, because I know one of the things you talk about is that Sunshine House focuses on harm reduction and social inclusiveness. And that is, I think, a great mandate. It's a fairly straightforward and simple one, but there's a lot of complications to it. From your perspective, when people talk about harm reduction, what do you want them to understand the importance of what harm reduction means?
For us, the simple thing about harm reduction, to keep it real simple, is just that we want people to live through the day. So we want people to be able to live to tomorrow, to continue to make changes in their life that they view they need to make, whatever that might mean. We don't have a prescriptive type of approach to it because everyone's journey is different and everyone is dealing with all sorts of different things. But the core value and the core principle is that everyone has the right to live. And that is the fundamental principle that we should all agree on, that every human being's life is worth value. And the other thing, and social inclusion, is a lot of the times that value is accentuated or exacerbated by the connections that we have with one another. And that's really key to ensuring that people are successful in the ways that they want to be successful. Not necessarily, monetarily, but having good connection, healthy community, a healthy relationship with one another, being able to trust one another and love one another and feel loved. The other thing that's really important is in a lot of our programming is ensuring that people have something to do. So recreation as a form of harm reduction is really key, because if people have things to do and they're engaged in their environment, whether that be at Sunshine House or outside of Sunshine House, then they'll have desire to make choices and make decisions in informed ways that will allow them to be safe and kind of live through the day. Trying to keep it simple because that's really what it is.
Yeah, I appreciate the explanation, because I think a lot of times people get confused when they talk about harm reduction and they talk about, programs that have been set up to sort of quote unquote help people. I mean, it depends whose definition of help we're talking about here. But from time to time, Levi, I think there's a sense that people will deal with people around the issue around harm reduction, assuming that they are already either sober or clean. And that clearly is, I mean, I'm not sure if I'm using the right term here, but it's a bit of an oxymoron. I mean, the reason you're looking for assistance through harm reduction is because you are not sober or clean. And part of that is, making sure that you're not being judgmental on people when you're really trying to ultimately help them. And so, you've seen a lot of that. But again, I'm asking you, from your perspective that you live and see this every day, Levi, to maybe share your thoughts about people who look at it and say, the best thing to do from a societal standpoint, this is old school, but well, maybe not so much old school, but put them in jail, like get them off the street, do this sorts of draconian kind of approach that seems to have at one point been kind of the norm. And along comes organizations like Sunshine House, and you're disruptive, you're changing it, you're bringing, as you say, shining a light on the fact that everybody's life is important. Everybody has the right to survive. Everybody has the right to be here. And so what you're doing is you're providing a runway and an opportunity for those sorts of people. But, you must have dealt with, or maybe you continue to deal with, a lot of stigma that people sort of say, well, that's not the right thing to do. There's other ways that are more, I don't even know the right word for this, Levi, just where people sort of say, well, just, kind of lock them up, right? What does that mean? I mean, clearly that's not the way to go, but I'd love from you to hear from your perspective how you have walked through that conversation and how you continue to believe and how you continue to explain it to those people who may not have the same understanding of it as you do.
Yeah, it's tricky because all of these things are loaded with presuppositions or predispositions around what people are allowed to do and who is worthy and who is able to do these things. And a lot of it is often tied to resources and the resources that individuals have. So, we know that, like you said, the stigma around particularly poor and often Indigenous people who engage in substance use are faced with when they do engage in these things. But it's often unfair and it's leveled in ways that are loaded with all sorts of different other conversations and topics for conversation that you can have. I just try to boil it down to the most kind of essential thing and the essential patterns that human beings have. And so human beings, as universally, there's only a few things that we can universally say as part of the human experience globally across cultures. So some of those things would be, creating components of social connection, whether that be through family and maintaining family connections through our entire lives, creating community for safety and being like community beings like that, as well as some of those other things that we universally have tried to do is try to explain our world and our relationships metaphysically or through religion or through ceremony and through spirituality in accessing using our brains and the power of our brains to kind of, figure out the purpose of being in our life. And so when you remove purpose of being from people's lives, often forcibly through things like residential schools, through things like child welfare systems where people no longer have real connection to individual or to community, and through all of these systems, a lot of the times it's going to take people a long time to recover, and communities a long time to recover from the impacts of that. And so if people aren't feeling connected in a lot of ways, you're going to try to balance that out in other types of ways. And sometimes, a lot of the time, substance users use it. And we've seen substance use being used throughout human history globally. Like, beer has existed for thousands of years. And there's been all sorts of types of natural types of ways that you can kind of escape reality in oftentimes controlled types of environments. We still have. So it's a lot of the time, I think that the work that we're trying to do is trying to really help people kind of revisit their relationships with substances so that it can be, and this goes across the board, like for us to understand that, substance use has been around for thousands and thousands of years. For as long as human beings have been around, we have been trying to kind of explain our world, the natural world, and our mental and physical and emotional and social needs through using substances. And so it's really important that our relationship with substances is done in a healthy, kind of respectful way. But we also have to understand that when everything is out of balance and out of line, substances can be a really important and good escape. And so when we're looking at in the folks in my family and in my own community and people that we work with every day who don't have access to ways in which they can connect and heal from a lot of disconnection and a lot of actual pain and violence that they've faced, it makes a lot of sense. But if we don't provide them with any kind of viable alternative, and our only alternative is, as you say, to lock people up, to stigmatize people, or to hope that the problem solves itself through whatever, or the alternative is abstinence. We know that that's not a realistic position for so many people that we work with. All of these things can work in conjunction or with each other and at various different points in people's lives. So we have to think of it as kind of like providing an ecosystem or a tapestry of support services that people can use at various points in their lives that will support them in their journeys. And particularly, the one thing that I get challenged with that I personally can never reconcile is you can't tell people they can't do anything, but you don't provide them the, mental health supports or cultural supports or any kind of viable options. And then thinking about it just from a standpoint of a civil society where we do have a pretty large and robust type of support network that is, supposed to be entrenched within Canadian society, it is often cheaper, and I hate this argument, but it is often more economically feasible to be supporting preventative and the types of measures that Sunshine House and other community organizations are doing than it is to lock people up or to, to try to force everyone to go through the square that might be abstinence-based programming without any kind of long-term mental health cultural supports attached to it.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think part of, the way society's been for years and years and years. I mean, you mentioned, residential schools, you mentioned, this issue around colonialism, the notion that if there's a problem, and the problem, of course, is it's always who decides it's the problem. The greater society decides if there's a problem. And one of the solutions to that problem is just if you move somebody out of sight, then they're out of mind. And somehow, there's a sense, well, now that's solved. And as you say, quite the opposite. I mean, I did some work with an organization. I helped raise a bit of money with an organization in Winnipeg. And one of the areas that I learned a tremendous amount from that organization was that if you send somebody who's had a troubled upbringing, or they're struggling, or they're really trying to find out who they are and they find themselves in trouble, and the idea is, well, we'll send them off to jail. It's like, does anybody think they're going to come out of jail as a better society, a better citizen, or are they going to learn more things in jail? So, you look at that argument, and I think that it was something that I learned that was very open-minding for me, just to understand that they are trying to find their reasons for being here, and everybody's journey is completely different, and trying to recognize that and support it, I think is what you're doing at Sunshine House, Levi, I think is very important. When you talk about harm reduction and helping people, and knowing that some of these people are on, say, drugs that are not legal, so there's an illegal element of these drugs that they're using, and you want to work with them through harm reduction. If somebody says to you, don't you see that as a moral issue? How do you respond to that question?
If we reframe substance use as not being a criminal issue, but as a health issue, then, in Canada, the Supreme Court of Canada at various different times has laid out and reaffirmed this in multiple different courses, that there is no room for morality in healthcare services. And so healthcare services and healthcare support services are to focus on saving the individual's life should the individual want to be saved. And so if we think of everything that we do around substance use in that mindset, there's no room for me to be moralistic about it, because it's legally not my responsibility. Now, as individuals, we can make choices about whether or not we want to be engaged. So if I had a moral objection to, people using illicit substances, then I can remove myself from my type of work, because it's not up to me. And the Supreme Court of Canada has made it clear that it's not up to me to decide what is right when a person is making healthcare decisions for themselves. And then the additional thing is, like, what is our alternative to that person using illicit substances if they don't have access to other types of substances or other types of services that can support them?
Let's kind of go into one of the major programs that I think Sunshine House has developed. And I want to talk about your Mobility Overdose Prevention Site, which is the acronym is MOPS. How did that get started? What was the importance and the initiative behind creating MOPS from Sunshine House?
The Mobile Overdose Prevention Site was actually initiated by work that preceded my involvement as the ED. So I was still working at Sunshine House, but I wasn't in part of that research project. It was a, what do they call it, global cafe style of symposium, and it worked with folks who were using drugs, and it brought a whole bunch of community members who were people who use drugs, and talked about what types of things that they would like to see out of a supervised consumption site if Manitoba was to ever get on that page. And so we released the report in March of 2019, and I was an acting ED with a couple of other folks. And then April 1st, when I stepped in as full-time ED, we released the report, and then people got a hold of it. Nothing was going to happen because the governing party of the province at the time was very adamant that this was not going to be a service that they were going to be exploring. And then in 2020, with the onset of the COVID-19 pandemic, the federal government also released the statement that Canada was in a drug toxicity crisis. We knew this from our own experiences. And in Winnipeg, we were seeing people who had been using substances, again, because Sunshine House has had relationships with folks for about 30 years. A lot of those people who were longtime substance users were coming in with injuries and experiencing death or extremely negative health outcomes. And we were like, okay, something needs to be done. And so we began working with our partners and developing strategies on how we could start moving the needle a bit to look at these types of services being involved in Winnipeg. And Sunshine House, everyone who works here is kind of from community. So right now we have 44 staff, and 37 of those staff were people who used our programs and services beforehand. Many of our employees are not trained in professional ways. So we're just kind of out there looking out for one another on a very interpersonal level, and trying to get people connected into more professional type services should they choose. So that's why we've looked at the overdose prevention site model as opposed to a clinical supervised consumption site type model. we have been supporting our partners like Aboriginal Health and Wellness in their development of hopefully being able to develop a permanent supervised consumption site. And so Sunshine House is more equipped to deal with something a little bit more personal, and that feels like Sunshine House. So we met with our community. We established the community advisory circle made up of people who would potentially be using the site, and they really informed kind of how this should look. And then we just applied for a variety of different grants and things to support the establishment of this. So we had to use federal grants. So we were successful with the support of Leah Gazan, the NDP MP here in Winnipeg Center, who was very supportive of this project. So she was able to help advocate for this at that level when we submitted it to Health Canada. And then the Substance Use and Addiction Program gave us an 18-month pilot project. So we were planning on being open about late June 2022 and then going until October 31st of last year. There was a lot of pushback because the political climate in Manitoba was not, again, as I said, supportive of this type of public health intervention. But we were able to start going on October 29th with the Mobile Overdose Prevention Site. The plus side of that delayed start was that it allowed us to kind of really work with our community in developing what types of things were needed. And we started in the winter time, and it was a rough, rocky winter. So starting in late October, early November was when we really started to operationalize. And by January of 2023, we were busy. We were busy. The name Mobile Overdose Prevention Site is a little bit of a misnomer because we are the only formal overdose prevention service in the city of Winnipeg. And again, at the guidance of our community advisory circle and the elders, it often means for us to be pretty stationary at the corner of Main and Logan. And Main Street Project has really been super helpful in providing us that space in their parking lot. And then working with community partners to do at least one evening stop the 5 days a week that we're open. So that includes community partners like Mount Carmel Clinic, Nine Circles Community Health, Ray Outreach Services, North End Women's Center, West Central Women's Center. All of these folks are really telling us kind of, this is where things are needed right now. And so we've been able to really do that. And when I say it's been very busy, we've had, in the 1 year that we were open, we had over 16,000 people visit our sites. And so when someone visits the site, they're greeted by a coffee, regardless of the day or the time of day or the temperature. They're greeted by coffee. There's a couple of folks who will be able to kind of guide you to some stuff. They have access to harm reduction material, so that can include clean supplies, such as clean smoking supplies and clean injection supplies, which is really, really beneficial because we know that in prevention terms, if you can prevent one person from contracting HIV, or in the long run, you'd be saving the healthcare system about $1 million over that person's lifetime. So providing people with those types of supplies is really, really important. Also, during the pandemic, we knew that safer smoking supplies for meth is not readily available in the city. And so a lot of the times that meant people were being exploited to access these types of things. And so we wanted to kind of mitigate those opportunities for exploitation by providing people opportunities just to grab clean bubbles, they're called. And then then we have a smoking tent, which is like a festival tent in the summertime, and then a ice fishing tent. The staff aren't in the tent while people are doing it. They're kind of outside the tent, and they're peeking their head in every couple of minutes just to make sure everybody is okay. And then within that, we also wanted to make sure that people who were using drugs could be actively engaged in the project, because that would be the most critical element to ensuring the success of the project. So we were able to also hire a bunch of folks who would be using the site to be actual employees of Sunshine House and, have all of the benefits and stuff associated with that. And really figuring out a way for people it to not be punitive, because we know that people who use drugs often face some challenges within traditional employment environments where that can be difficult. So how we restructured it was just to be like, okay, let's make sure that we have our core staff who can be there and operate. And then if folks are available, this is how many hours a week we have for community members to work, and they can kind of make their own schedule and feel supported. And then they would have a peer coordinator who is who was attached to them so that if they needed help with housing or things like facilitating visits or facilitating healthcare or ID or any of that kind of stuff, they would have somebody attached. So with the Winnipeg Foundation, they were able to support that in a very small type of way. Then as it got very public that 16,000 people in a calendar year in a 6-hour period per day over 5 days a week is a lot. And over 7,000 of those visits were people who were using substances. So that works out to being about 2 people using per hour that were open, or 2 to 3 people using per hour that were open. And that can include inhalation, snorting, or injection of substances, as well as providing opportunities for people to test their substances. Admittedly, that piece didn't have the pickup that we initially thought, mostly because people don't have any alternatives, right? So if they've already spent what limited income they have on the substance, then they're going to have to use it regardless. So the option that people are presented with when they're there is like, well, I could test my substances or I could just use in front of you. And either way, I'll feel safe and supported. The other thing that's really important to know that in those 7,000 times that people have used substances at our site, only 31 times did people experience an overdose. And to put that into comparison with other services, so we've been supporting the establishment of a pop-up shelter in the wintertime that would be open every night in Winnipeg. That's -10 over the wintertime from December until the end of March. And anytime it's open, there's teams from Sunshine House, One Just City, Main Street Project, and Siloam and Salvation Army who are there supporting. We're at 12 weeks now that it's been open. There's been more overdose and drug toxicity events in that space than there has been at the overdose prevention site in the entirety that we've been open. So what it means to me, what that indicates to everybody is that if we're providing people with the opportunity to be using in spaces where they feel safe and supported, that they'll also be making decisions that will be more beneficial to everybody. And so when we think of just this one overdose kind of event in a non-sanctioned space, so that could be a community drop-in center, a library bathroom, or the bathroom at Tim Hortons, or even behind like your apartment building, we think of the individual who has to first identify and respond in the trauma that they might experience by having to save somebody's life or feel inadequately resourced because maybe they don't have naloxone on them and they don't know what to do and they can't identify what the problem is. And then they have to wait for the ambulance. And then oftentimes an ambulance or a paramedic will show up. And the WFPS has been really, really good. Those 31 times that we have had to call, they've been there pretty promptly. And we've only run into a couple of different conflictual moments, but it's been overall really well done. But even then, so that ties up an ambulance and a paramedic team that could be responding to a different type of call. The biggest thing that Overdose Prevention Site has taught all of us is that when you provide people with the space and community members and even just the minimal amount of resources that are available at MOPS is people will make the best decisions possible for them. And then that turns out to be the best decisions possible for the community as a whole.
Who has jurisdiction over ensuring that you look at safe injection sites? Is that a federal or a provincial? Who has the jurisdiction to decide that you're going to move ahead on that?
In Manitoba, it's federal. So we have a federal exemption through the Canada Health Act that allows our staff and our community members to come into contact with illicit substances. And it protects them from like any kind of legal liabilities that they might have. But it also lays out a lot of really strict frameworks on how we can operationalize. Manitoba is the only province, with the exception, I think, of New Brunswick, and I think maybe Northwest Territories and Nunavut, who don't have provincial or territorial mechanisms in place to build overdose response strategies at the community level. So that means if, say an organization was trying to put in maybe just like a safe injection room in their clinic because they're tired of people using their bathroom for that, they would still have to go through the federal process. Whereas in BC or in Alberta or maybe in Ontario, there's provincial mechanisms that are often a lot more faster and a lot more tailored to the needs of the community or the needs of that jurisdiction. We're always open to working with whatever the provincial ruling party is in Manitoba and the province of Manitoba and the different, particularly now it's housing, addictions, and homelessness department in kind of facilitating this type of mechanism. And the one thing that I think was really interesting, so we were like not scared, but we were like, okay, this is going to be really, really strict. But actually, in our community consultations and in that initial report and in what the community desired, things around safety and safety for everybody in the community were much stricter as determined by the community. So, for example, our community, when we were developing this and we're talking about going mobile, they were like, we can't be anywhere near where kids congregate. So that makes going to the West End pretty difficult because there's lots of playgrounds and there's lots of schools around there, but we want to also respect the safety of everybody involved. And we want to make sure that we're not disrupting communities when we're there. And then the other thing was like our community has been really, really, it's really important no matter where we are, we have to be responsible and leaving the neighborhood in a better way than where we got it. So like going out and, cleaning up the parking lots where we're at, maybe providing sharps disposal and letting folks know like, hey, we're going to be in your neighborhood. And if you find any needles or anything like that, you can drop them off here and we'll safely dispose of them for us. And that's worked out. Like we've had calls from West Broadway and different neighborhoods and just been like, hey, I know you have the overdose prevention site and I found some suspicious stuff. Would you be able to come pick it up? And because we have that exemption, we'd be like, yes, gladly, we'll gladly do that kind of stuff.
So in this case, I mean, you've got MOPS, which is very much a part of the community. And as you say, clearly is established as something that is very unique and to the city of Winnipeg. In that regard, Levi, just to kind of get a sense of it, because it's mobile, if somebody in the public were to see somebody who they thought was having issues, whether it would be, they're overdosing or something, is there a number they call? What's the relationship between getting somebody who's in an area in the community who is clearly in trouble and is being challenged or is overdosing, and the mobility overdose prevention site MOPS coming out to that area? How does that work?
Unfortunately, no, we don't have the capacity to respond to emergencies that are happening. And so people would rely on the WFPS and 911 if you saw someone in an active overdose or active drug toxicity event. And again, I do want to reiterate that, in most of our interactions, it's been really wholly positive, and they are well equipped to deal with these things because they have been dealing with it. If they notice that folks are consistently not able to access other services because maybe things are a little far for them or like there's some mobility, there's other services that would be able to support people in that kind of way, like DCSP can help folks in the downtown neighborhoods. And Main Street Project also has a very mobile outreach service van. And one of the things that we can do is like, we really want to work in collaboration with other services that already exist. So Street Connections through the WRHA also exist to provide people with access to disposal or access to clean or new supplies. And they have a really well-established route. And so you can look at and connect with them if you're looking for just accessing those types of things. The things we can do is if people call and we are able to be staffed and out that night, we can come and do some drug checking for you if you wanted to do that. If people are noticing, like right now, our jurisdiction or our guidelines, we can go as far west as Polo Park. We can go as far north as kind of Inkster if you're thinking of a circle and going into St. Boniface, Osborne, and then kind of in that circle area, we can kind of go all around there. But we're really only super mobile in that capacity right now because of funding constraints and because of the lack of other services, only on Thursday, Friday, Saturday evenings after 6:30. And we've only been able to really launch that this winter, again, thanks to support from the Winnipeg Foundation, who have really, really stepped up to help us ensure that we're able to provide this while we were in this kind of extreme challenge of at October 31st, we were possibly going to have to shut down.
So Levi, how long have you been in the chair as Executive Director of Sunshine House?
It'll be 5 years on April 1st.
Okay, perfect. Congratulations. And
Thank
if
you.
I were just to say, put your crystal ball out in front of you for a second, Levi Foy, and say, where do you see Sunshine House in the next 5 years? What would you like to see one of the major steps, the positive steps that could be taken under your leadership and your team? I mean, it's a team effort, but just from your perspective.
Whatever happens in 5 years, My honest to God hope would be that we don't see 17,000 people a year at the Mobile Overdose Prevention Site, and that there's more appropriate services available for people. What we're doing right now is great, and we have such a wonderful team who's able to kind of start this conversation and really do this. But we're at a point now where people require things that we can't provide, and so we're doing our best, and it's a band-aid on a massive wound. So hopefully we're a lot more mobile. Hopefully we're able to transition some of our really experienced team into leadership positions in a formal site that wouldn't necessarily be Sunshine House. And then also in 5 years, it would be really nice to go back to some of the actual, like a lot of the preventative stuff and doing a lot more recreational programming and not having 32,000 visits in a year. Like that's nice to be able to have that kind of contact, but you can't really do a lot of relational support at that high capacity. We're doing it now because everything is in constant flux, and we're seeing a lot of the impacts of various different things that are beyond our control. Housing crisis, climate crisis, all of these things that are really contributing to people's stress, anxiety, and ability to kind of cope in the day-to-day life.
So Levi, thank you so much for your time. It's been an education for me just to listen to your personal journey, but the journey of Sunshine House and the great work that they continue to do in the community. If somebody was listening to this and they said, hey, I'd like to get involved, I'd like to help out, what would they do?
Go on our websites or visit our Instagram page. It's probably our most active one. So the website is just sunshinehousewpg.org. And then it's just Sunshine House WPG on Instagram. And they can reach out that way. We're really fortunate as an organization that we've always kind of retained a communications person, which is a real luxury in nonprofit world. So Jenny is just fantastic at kind of fielding all of those initial contacts and really getting people connected to who they need to be connected with. So that's really, really great. Or you can give us a call, visit our website.
I'll put the website and the Instagram stuff, all the social stuff, Levi, I'll put that into the show notes of this episode. But again, just thank you, Levi Foy, Executive Director, Sunshine House. Thank you very much for taking some time to speak to me on this Humans on Right podcast.
Yeah, it's been great. Thanks a lot, Stuart.
Thanks for listening to Humans on Rights. A transcript of this episode is available by clicking the link in the show notes of this episode. Humans on Rights is recorded and hosted by Stuart Murray. Social media marketing by Buffy Davey. Music by Doug Edmond. For more, go to humanrightshub.ca.
Produced and distributed by the Sound Off Media Company.